Very much, Anne. Thank you, CNS, for inviting me to give the seminar. So I'm from the Atomic Weapons Establishment in the UK, which is responsible for providing the warheads for the UK's nuclear deterrent. And I sit within the Nuclear Treaty Verification team with an interest in arms control verification research. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today, as Anne said, is how I've used virtual worlds for storytelling in a number of topics, but also in the non-proliferation area. And what I'm going to show is what's possible now. For you who are students, this is possible now. This isn't state of the art, it's not cutting edge technology, it is established. So, a bit of scene setting regardless of how you've got here. At some point, with the work that you've done, you're going to be in a position to transfer information, experiences, concepts, whatever, to other people, and one of the most effective ways of doing that is to encapsulate the information you want to transfer in a good story. Because pretty much no matter what you produce, whether it's a report, a memo, a thesis, an article, if you frame it correctly, it will come across as a story to convey that information you want to transfer from your brain, the concept, into other people's brains. And you're in a very fortunate position if you're starting out in your careers now, because quite simply, you have more choices for how you can tell your stories than at pretty much any generation previous to you. You can write reports, which we've been doing since the beginning of writing's invention. You can produce articles that can now be both physical or electronically distributed. You can generate images and animations to share the information. You can do, as I will show you, create virtual worlds that people can explore to understand the concepts that you're trying to explain to them or convey to them. And there is at the moment, the ubiquitous Twitter as a way of spreading information. A number of these simply didn't exist, well, certainly when I was starting out my career. However, with great choice can come great confusion as to which particular technique is best suited for the story that you want to tell. And so one of the things I'm hoping that you might take away from my presentation is what the state of the possible is with virtual worlds, and perhaps you'll consider them, whereas perhaps you might not have previously, as to use them in the stories that you need to tell in your work. So I'm going to demonstrate what I've done using 3 case studies or stories. And I'll tell you what the story I wanted to tell with each was, the choices I made in building the environment to allow people to explore it, and the data sources, the hardware that was used to create them. And all of the work that you're going to see was done on a workstation laptop. Not this particular laptop, but one that's not dissimilar. So the other amazing thing about now is that the computational hardware isn't the barrier anymore. And as hopefully you'll see, the software isn't the barrier anymore. So, a bit of background, just for those of you that haven't come across these things. When you're wanting to convey the information, the concept, sit down and have a think about what is the story you're trying to tell, and get that straight in your head first, and then decide how you're going to tell it. Just because you have access to a fancy tool that can do an amazing animation, if it's not the right tool for the job to tell the story you want to tell, there's no need to use it. Also, something you may or may not have come across in general concepts, again, with conveying information, there is this old adage, what I'm told, I forget. What I see, I remember. And what I do, I understand. So these can be useful to consider when, again, you're choosing which type of story you want to tell, what thing you're trying to convey. Of course, these points are a gross oversimplification of reality, but they are useful as a mini story to help you think about approaching particular problems. So the stories I wanted to tell would allow the people I'm telling the stories to, whether in person or remotely, because my digital world has gone out into the real world, to allow them to literally follow in the footsteps of the storyteller. Either because their location is a remote location that they can't get to, or quite simply it may be a hazardous area that is difficult to get to as a matter of routine. So, the ubiquitous background, the content slide. So I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, my work. I'll go through each of the case studies, the mini stories about using work, starting with the test site for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is a remote and inaccessible site for the topic of this seminar. Then there's the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organisation's field exercise in 2014 and associated technical data, which is a remote but accessible location. And finally, the letterpress verification simulation, which was in the UK, which was local to me, at least, and accessible. And you'll see how I've approached crafting my story, both by choice and by necessity, given those different concepts. And technology permitting, we'll do some live demos, including at the very end the virtual reality system for those who are interested. And again, if there's time, a discussion of the tools and data used if it hasn't been covered during the main talk. And there will be inevitably time for questions at the end. And just to note, only open source or unclassified data has been used in everything that's being presented. So what about me? So I've been at AWE for a number of years, and in my current role, my areas of interest are imaging remote sensing, which is a sort of a capture-all topic, which also links into 3D data visualization, because if you capture all this lovely remote sensing data, you want to see various different types of it in the same location, and hence novel uses of visualization techniques, including virtual reality and active or passive stereo displays. And what that means is when you have gone to the cinema and seen a 3D movie, the display is set up so that one image is shown to the right eye, which is different to the left eye, and your brain combines those just as it does in normal life to give you depth perception as well as just seeing a general image. My background is physics, so I've been interested in sensors, the platforms that they go on, whether they are unmanned aircraft or satellites or aeroplanes, and the impacts and opportunities of all of the above within the area of nuclear arms control. And some of my experience, provide technical support to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organisation on behalf of the UK government as part of our support of that and commitment to that treaty in the areas of visual observation and imaging remote sensing, which are techniques that can be used by the organisation during an on-site inspection. I attended the integrated field exercise that the organisation held in 2014 as one of the UK's official observers. I was also a player in a UK-Norway initiative exercise, which some of you may be familiar with. And I was also a player in the letterpress activity, which you'll find out more about later in the seminar. And I have presented work at international conferences, including earlier this week, and I've previously worked as an experimental plasma physicist within the company, and my PhD is in experimental plasma physics. So, on to story one. So the concept of this story is presenting work that has been done. So you've done an important piece of work, your office, within a team, and you now need to share that with the wider world. And this is about the North Korean test site, and the work was initiated by the visit the map and the big show. So what I'm going to do now is transfer across to a talk that I gave at the 2017 Science and Technology Conference hosted by the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organisation, and go through that to give you, well, to show you how I crafted this particular story to share the work that had been done. So as you can see, the title was Recreating and Exploring the DPRK Nuclear Test Site in 3D to Calculate Possible Overburdens for Detonations. I was lead author, and my co-author, Dr. Neil Selby, is a seismologist at AWE who provided the seismological calculations. Hopefully most of you are aware of this. Back in 2018, the DPRK invited a small number of international journalists to witness an event at their nuclear test site. However, no experts were invited. The effect of explosions on the site's capabilities were not verified. However, very interestingly, a map was shown with the test locations marked on it, which is the first time the North Koreans indicated where they claimed that their tests occurred. So, the map, what was so great about the map? Well, it's an annotated topographical map of the region showing, amongst other things, this digital laser pointer works. So the locations of the individual tests, the locations of the adits or the tunnel entrances, schematics for where the tunnels ran, and indication of locations of buildings and other facilities. So it included, and for the data that I had, it wasn't much better than you can see on the screen, contours and point height measurements. But there was no way to know how accurate the locations indicated were, or even whether the location on the map, whether the map truly represented the actual location where the nuclear test site was. So that initiated some work which is very familiar to, I'm sure, people in the audience, which was assess the photographs and video openly available, geolocate the map, extract coordinates from it, and then calculate the test locations using seismic waveforms from the tests and the indicated location of the 2009 test, because this particular seismic calculation was a relative reconstruction of locations, so it needed a fiducial point to start from. Compare the calculated locations to the indicated locations on the map, and then use photographs and videos from the journalists to try and geolocate the added locations to allow a simple overburden calculation to be made. And finally display those results in a 3D reconstruction of the site. So I'm assuming this is old news to most of the people in the audience, but how to go about geolocation. The data used was US Geological Survey terrain data, 5-meter resolution, photographs of the map that the North Koreans displayed, imagery from ground level, and high-resolution satellite imagery from Esri and Google, the usual suspects in that area. And the tools, as mentioned, a workstation, a laptop, and geographic information system software, in this case the ubiquitous ARC, and a 3D visualization tool called GeoVisionary, which we'll see more of as I go through the seminar. So again, old news, but to convey to the audience, who is a broad, both technical and non-technical audience, how do you magically find somewhere on a map that's displayed? Well, because I had the elevation data for the region, I could compare the two, except I couldn't because, of course, the elevation data simply shows height locations. So this is a section of that data, there is nothing there to compare to the map, which showed topographical features and contours. but thanks to the joys of GIS, you can generate contours from the terrain. So with a bit of iteration to try and match my generated contours to the intervals of the contours on the North Korean map, I was then able to start comparing the general qualitative shape of the contours on my contours to their map, and then start identifying areas where hopefully a point on their map, in this case this location with a height measurement, reasonably compared to contours generated from the height, and then a bit of iteration to choose a specific location and decide that yes, that point and that point are the same, and using standard GIS techniques generate approximately 12 of those tie points scattered as uniformly across the map as possible, then use the warp tools and geolocation tools within the software to then geolocate the map. So this is now just a little picture with the contours from the terrain data overlaid on the now geolocated map. And as ever, it's difficult to see, but take my word for it that the match between the two was qualitatively good enough to confirm that yes, it was the same location. And this is just an image of the map geolocated, which is good, but it helps if you can look at these things in 3D. So this is now the map geolocated in the 3D software, which allows me to fly around and explore the location, and some obvious things become obvious when you can see them in this sort of context, which is the scaled size of the icons used for the buildings on the map were about 200 meters in diameter, because they had to be shown on a scaled map. So clearly they had no true correlation to where buildings actually were, because you wouldn't be able to see them if they were correctly scaled on the indicated map. So having access to that tool helped me reassure myself that the work that had been done was good, because I was able to fly around and literally see the shape of the terrain and compare it, because I'd wrapped it over the terrain, the shape of the contours on the map, and they matched well enough to justify carrying on the work, which was to then extract coordinates from the declared locations from the map, and because they'd used a flag as the icon, there were 5 obvious points that could be extracted that may be actually where they were saying this is the point where the test occurred. So I extracted all 5, shared them with Dr. Selby. He chose the base of the flat file for the 2009 test as his fiducial for his calculation, and his calculation and output the locations for the reconstructed epicenters for each of the tests, and the uncertainty ellipse, which is basically an ellipse within which there is a 90% confidence that the true location of the epicenter lies within that ellipse. So converted into a shapefile, which is a standard GIS file format, and loaded both into ARC and into the visualization tool. And the results look like this, which was very reassuring, because one, the general distribution of the tests seemed to match. I was personally pleasantly amazed that two of the flags lay within the uncertainty ellipses, and for the other 2 they were no more than 110 meters from the edge of the uncertainty ellipse, which I found pretty amazing, considering these were reconstructions from seismic signals that had travelled a very long distance away from the actual event. And for various technical reasons that I won't go into because I'm not the expert, it wasn't possible to reconstruct a stable result apparently for the final test, hence why there's no calculated information for it. But this was kind of great, reassuring, and it justified then thinking, well, what more can we do to extract information from the data set that we have? And then it occurred that because we've got the terrain data, and during the destruction event, the journalists were allowed to see and photograph the tunnel entrance for these tests, except for the first one. Then, well, we can do a simple overburden calculation, and this is all the information justifies is a simple, what's the height above sea level of both the indicated and the calculated epicenter locations, what's the height of the adit, take one from the other and you have a very simple right angle triangle result of indicative overburden. But then that raised the question of exactly where are the adits. So other people have published results, but when I dived into that, I couldn't find precise coordinates that I could then reproduce. And obviously when doing this sort of thing with the access to the imagery, you want to crank the handle yourself to come up to see whether you agree with other people's answers. So now a slightly different type of geolocation, but again one I'm sure is familiar with people in the audience. Looking at here, this is a satellite image. Here is an excerpt of one of the photographs from the destruction event, and inspection indicates that this hut is this hut with the blue roof. And doing that, you can then, using other photographs and being able to view in 3D, various other tools, give confidence that you can geolocate where that adit entrance is to within the margins of uncertainty given the nature of the information you have. And so this is just an animation showing what that looked like in the tool, and the fact that by placing, for example, a photograph that's of the area that was taken on one side of a canyon, estimating where that was, putting it in place, being able to look at it and looking the distance, helped give confidence that this general area was indeed the area where the adit was. So then I can do the calculation. Here are the results. A not unsurprising general trend of increasing overburden. The biggest discrepancy in vertical results is from the first test, but there's possible non-technical reason for that. And also, so this just shows a plot of that difference in vertical of calculated overburden between indicated and the calculated epicenters, which again was pretty amazing that for most of them it was sub about 70 meters. So this is what that looks like with the data overlaid, because you have a 3D tool to help understand the concept of where do those different layers lie. Here I've taken the terrain and copied and pasted it and offset it by 100 meters, so that if you then take, for example, regenerate the shapefile and just set it to display at the height of the adit entrance, it then gives you a visual cue as to where the relative depth of those events. And so I'll not go through the conclusions because that's not the point of this particular presentation, but I hope you can see, or I hope you agree, that crafting the story in this way, using the tools, being able to present the information using a three-dimensional tool and generate animation for the images shown, helps convey the complex, the inherently geospatial nature of both the work and the data. And very quickly, because I'm sure someone, and it helps that it can produce really nice briefing material as well, someone is bound to be intrigued as to, well, why was there a big difference with the first test? So again, in the present audience, cartography, you've got to build a map. Someone physically has to build the map. Here you can see that there's quite a lot going on in that map. And here is the location of the first test, which, when you stop and look at the map, as we did, it starts looking a little bit suspiciously cramped. And then when you look at the, in 2 dimensions, the calculated result and the indicated location, they're within the uncertainty ellipses, but it still doesn't seem that unusual until you look at it in 3 dimensions. And then you see that the calculated result places the epicenter right at the top of a ridge, and the indicated location is down the ridge. Now that may be accurate, but this might make you suspicious that maybe this is just because the person who had to make the map just pushed that icon in a bit just so the map worked in general. We have no way of knowing, but when you can see things like this, it perhaps makes you think that it's a more trivial cartographic issue that's caused perhaps that location to be moved rather than something more nefarious. So that was the talk. So that was the story. We did some work. These are the results, and use the visualization tools to hopefully, given the 12-minute allocated time for the talk at the conference, convey that information within the time scale. And now hopefully the next video will work. So we go on to story number 2. I think this is a better way to do it than how it's been done before. Again, I'm sure in your work at some point you will think exactly that and do a piece of work where you want to say, this is a better way of doing it. And if it's an established technique that you're looking to improve, there's always a difficulty in trying to convince people to change things to make it better. So in this case, it's related to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organisation's integrated field exercise in 2014. And to save my voice and to stop you getting truly bored of it, hopefully this video will explain all.
A request for an on-site inspection has been submitted by a member state to the Director General of the CTBTO. An ambiguous seismic event was detected by the International Monitoring System a few days earlier, and Alluvia believes Meridia has detonated an underground nuclear device. The Operations Support Centre, OSC, is immediately set up, and on a cold November morning, OSC members and the core inspection team start work so that they are fully prepared to be at the point of entry within 6 days of receiving the request. If the inspection goes ahead, in their first meeting they are informed about the content of the OSI request and briefed about the suspicious event.
This event might be artificial. There is hyperreality of the explosion. This is seismic data, and this is radionuclide data. We detected unusually high concentration of some isotopes in an isotope.
The teams have a lot to do. They don't have the time to wait for the Executive Council to vote to see if the OSI is approved or rejected. They must prepare a mandate and an initial inspection plan, and organise transport for everything and everyone, so that everything is ready if the inspection is approved. How difficult is it to move over 150 tonnes of equipment across the world within the time allowed?
This is a compilation of video blogs that were created during the exercise.
From Meridia's main airport.
They have spent 5 days working intensively on a plan to collect evidence, should there be any, of the detonation of a possible nuclear device. The inspection team and the inspected state party representatives have their morning meeting. The feeling is tense because nothing can be done until the inspection mandate is formally handed over. But at present, Meridia refuses to accept it. Mid-meeting, Malcolm received the call from the Prime Minister of Meridia. The issues are resolved and the mandate can be officially received. The inspection team set to work straight away. They have 36 hours to arrive at the base of operations. They immediately send out a reconnaissance team to a possible location. Meanwhile, the inspected state party has the right to check over the equipment that has been brought into the country, to ensure only approved items are included and that the list matches the submitted documentation.
That's point of entry, the inspection area and the base of operations. So that tent city was where the inspectors were
Inspection
based.
gets underway. Each day there will be up to 5 missions going out into the field. Each sub-team has a specific objective. One of the first tasks is to carry out an aerial initial overflight over the whole inspection area.
We're looking for fresh landslides and some roads with heavy tracks and any perimeter lines, any heavy cables and things like that.
The inspection area is up to 1,000 square kilometers, and if there were a site where an underground nuclear test occurred, signatures on the surface might be only a couple of meters across. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. While the visual observations team gather video and images from across the whole inspection area, the seismic team also want to get their installations set up as soon as possible.
The cavern collapse events that we're looking at are rapidly decaying. Right now we're at the diminishing end of that exponential decay.
The seismic stations are extremely sensitive and will potentially detect tremors from events many thousands of kilometers away. By correlating measurements between the stations, they can determine which events have occurred inside the inspection area, and this helps home in on potential areas of interest. So far, the inspection team have carried out a comprehensive survey of the inspection area during their overflight, and they have also deployed seismic stations in as many places as they can. But the one type of data we haven't talked about yet is any form of radioactivity. The inspection team are sending out teams to investigate areas on the ground, and in each location they monitor the environment.
I measure the gamma radiation, and if there is any, let's say, elevation of radiation above the background, we can make an identification.
The name of the game is to eliminate areas from their inquiries.
So this is an anomaly that they've pointed out. It's a crater in Meridia. This is a watering hole. It fills with water when it rains, but we'll allow them to take a sample here.
Even when there are plausible explanations, the inspection team will measure gamma radiation in the location, take soil samples for analysis in the laboratory, and also keep a lookout for further anomalies. With this level of investigation, the inspection team are bound to uncover evidence of a nuclear explosion, should there be any. And that, at present, is the big question, as the chief of the radionuclide sub-team explains.
We have surpassed 50 missions. We've seen lots of natural radioactivity. So we're measuring radioactivity, but just normal natural radioactivity.
It seems that wherever they look, there are no traces of relevant isotopes to be found.
Nothing about background.
The inspection team now have to complete their initial inspection report. Without any significant evidence of nuclear explosion, will the inspection be called off by the Executive Council? Come back next time to find out. There is a sense of unease because so far the inspection team have not yet registered any measurements of radioactivity above the natural background level. Does that mean there was definitely no nuclear detonation?
No, there's a possibility of complete containment of every atom. So we would say in the radionuclide business we can't prove a negative, but we feel that we can prove a positive.
The inspection team will know by the end of the day if the Executive Council has decided to call off the on-site inspection. In the meantime, they keep taking measurements and going on field missions. The Inspected State Party has the right, within limits, to assign areas off limits for investigation, each called a Restricted Access Site, or RAS. and they have assigned a new RAS in the north of the inspection area. However, the recent data analysed shows some seismic activity in the area of this RAS, and the inspection team have asked to drive nearby. The inspected state party eventually agree, but insist there must be only visual observations. The inspection team has other ideas, however.
We couldn't do any sampling at all within the quarry, they're very insistent on that. So my thinking with my subsequent leader was that we'd take a sticky smear from the actual tyre of the vehicle and actually drip through the quarry. So any residue that was in the quarry was at least going to get some of that. And they were quite surprised when we done it as well, but they didn't object.
By the end of the day, the call to cancel the inspection hasn't come. So the inspection now moves into the continuation period. They will now be able to use a wider array of equipment, mostly geophysical, to make more detailed investigation of the area. Are the inspected state party getting nervous?
No filming.
Find out next time. The inspection team have visited over 20 sites of interest and taken a huge number of measurements. They have now narrowed their search to 2 polygons of interest. Both are located in quarries and both have similar features. Blocked access, a pad made of foreign material, conduits emerging from the ground. Moreover, the inspected state party cannot, or will not, answer many questions about either location. The inspection team carried out a detailed investigation of both sites with techniques ranging from subsurface gas sampling to active seismic measurements. The results were compelling and included noble gas measurements of radioactive xenon-131M and 133 and argon-37, often described as smoking gun evidence of a nuclear explosion. Meridia has persistently denied any wrongdoing and insists that the call for on-site inspection was politically motivated. The inspection team have submitted their preliminary findings documents to the Executive Council of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, who will draw their own conclusions as to whether the treaty has been violated. In the meantime, the leader of the inspection team, Gregor Malik, gives his view of what has happened.
You have a lot of indications that there are signatures which are...
Yes, but did they detonate a nuclear device?
So that's for others to decide.
Of course, whether or not a nuclear test has been conducted wasn't the point of the exercise. IFE 14 was to help develop the on-site inspection verification element of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And when the treaty comes into force, on-site inspection will be a very important deterrent to states who might want to develop a nuclear capability. Just in case you cannot bear not to know, the people who devised the scenario did intend that Meridia had detonated a nuclear device. Let's hope it never happens in real life.
So there you go. I hope you now know a lot more about the CTBTO's work in on-site inspections and what goes into them and how complicated they are. So coming back to my story, as mentioned earlier, I was involved with technical sport in the run-up to the exercise and attended as one of the UK's observers for a week. And if we go, so when I came back, I thought, could the inspectors have had better briefings when they were going into country and when they were in country? Because, which you'll see in a moment in another presentation I'll run through, they were briefed using what would be considered traditional ways, using maps, both satellite imagery and topographic. But I came back with my knowledge of what's possible with 3D visualization and thought, I think there was a better way. There was also noticed that there was a variability as to how well particular inspectors were briefed on just the layout of the topography of the inspection area, depending on when they came in country throughout the exercise. So could they have had better briefings, and would that actually be of any use? Because as you can see, there's a lot that they need to do. There's a very short time period in which various things have to happen. If you're interested for more information, the on the CTBTO's website, you can find links through to each of the video blogs that were created. So that was just a 10-minute summary of them, and they're very informative about what went on what went on during the inspection. And that's a link to the video that you've just seen. So, hopefully, yes. That's better. Oh yeah, so my mistake. The previous talk for the DPRK was from 2019. These are from 2017. And so here the story was, I think there are better ways to brief the inspectors. And again, 12 minutes to convey that message. Work with myself and my co-author, Dr. Jenny Stevanovic at AWE. And as you can see, it's again very familiar to people in the audience, classic, laser pointer one again. Classic satellite image, very useful, gives you an idea of the general topography, but clearly there's a lot going on in this landscape. But you always have the classic question, even if you can see the contour map, are those contours indicating an upslope or a downslope? So, with only 12 minutes, and as you can see how much was skipped over in the 10-minute video from the whole inspection, I thought the best way to demonstrate how 3D maps could be used was to show and not tell. So I generated 2 briefings that were given as if the audience were inspectors about to go into country. So I can repeat those for you now. So for the next 5 minutes or so, you will be CTBTO inspectors about to go into country and being briefed at the 100-day mark of the inspection. So, welcome to Vienna, where it all kicks off. And this is the briefing for the area of Meridia indicating where the inspection is due to take place, with the inspected area marked. Here is the point of entry, which is the international airport, and the proposed location for the base of operations. And the area within the red polygon has 50-centimetre satellite imagery. The general terrain is 30-metre spatial resolution. So as we fly over, the terrain, you can immediately see that it's a mix of plateau, wide valleys, and shoreline to the Dead Sea. And depending on how well that's coming up on the big screens, note that it's very rugged terrain, so it'll be very difficult to traverse across the terrain, and that you should be guided by the detail in the imagery rather than the terrain model, because of obviously at 30-metre resolution a lot of these rugged details are filtered out. This is where the base of operations is planned to be located, with access through this dirt road off the main tarmac road and into a chain-linked compound. This is where will be the clean side with general access in and out of the compound. And as you can see, this is the provisional layout, which is a standard layout for the base of operations. And as we fly over, we now transit onto the dirty side, where all of the vehicles going in and out for the field missions will be stationed for decontamination purposes, if required. And they will use this dirt road leading down to the main tarmac highway. And to make things a bit clearer, we can take away the white background and show the plan directly onto the location where it's planned for. Also, we were able to find reference books showing topology or topography and the geology of the area. So those have been scanned and geolocated and have also now been wrapped over the landscape to give you a better idea of, when interrogating these topography maps, again, which way is an upslope and which way is a downslope. And those of you who require this information for your expertise will have access to it in the normal way. And here's just a section of the geological maps. And there ends your pre-brief. And I now am reasonably confident you are better aware of the general topology of the inspection area than most of the inspectors were before they went in country, simply because in that 15 seconds fly down of going from a top-down view, seeing it as a classical map, to then on the side, you then can literally see what the terrain looks like, which would of course take an age to try and explain using only words. So we are now at a nominal 100-day point of the inspection. A lot of data has been collected, and most of this has now been put into the 3D visualization. So again, welcome inspectors. A review of data collected so far at day 100. So you'll see the main inspection area outlined in red, the identified polygons of interest as smaller rectangles outlined in red, and here we have a shapefile indicating the flight path of the helicopter from the initial overflight in the blue arrows. The red arrows indicate where photographs were taken during that initial overflight. You see that we've been able to add shapefiles for the road network and water bodies. And now we fly over to where we've been able to reconstruct high-resolution elevation data and stitch together aerial photography from the imagery that was collected during the additional overflight, and that's been added to the terrain. So now if we look at one of the photographs that was taken of an area of interest in situ where it was taken and fly through, we see polygon 29, which is one of our major areas of interest. If we update to increase the detail that's rendered at this part of the fly-through, you can see mapped on the ground snail trails indicating magnetometry data that was collected. And you can see the reconstruction isn't quite perfect, but certainly good enough for mission planning and virtual field work. And if we now go underground, we can see some of the subsurface data, in this case the ground resistivity tomography data, where 2 survey lines were taken with that anomalous item that you can see in the resistivity data sitting below anomalous signal from the magnetometry data, which we have yet to have clarification from the inspected state party as to what is buried there and whether they will allow us to dig it up and investigate. Here is polygon 18, which is the second area of interest. Less area that we've been able to generate high resolution terrain and aerial imagery, but that's just some of the microgravity data that was wrapped over the top. Of course, not all of us are here at the briefing today. We have a team out, and this is the live GPS feed from their vehicle as they head on their way to their visual observation and radionuclide mission. So now we'll come back to polygon 29 and take a slow pan across, so that those of you who have not been able to go out into the field to this location can get a familiarisation of its layout and its significant features. Not least the fact that this particular plateau we're running along now is in fact obscured by when being viewed by both on the hills above and the quarry floor below. And that suspicious gravel-covered metal plate is in fact, coming back to reality, where the red star is on the 3D print of the quarry and where the surface ground zero for the nuclear explosion according to the exercise actually was. So again, I hope, one, you found that informative, but two, you also now believe my original premise that I think there is a better way of doing the briefing. It doesn't eliminate the need for all of the traditional briefing techniques, but it's certainly a really useful one to add to the toolkit, especially when you can do things, as we'll see later, like put on a virtual, both explore at the desktop, but also put on a virtual reality system and explore in virtual reality.
Can I ask 2 questions now, or do you want them at the end?
You can ask 2 now.
So the helicopter path, was that, what data was that?
That was the GPS data from the instruments on board the helicopter converted into a shapefile with a 1 Hertz readout.
So oh wow, oh cool. So you could use like any transponder data to do a similar, turn it into a similar shapefile.
Yeah, you can turn it in. Hold that thought.
Okay.
And second, was there a second question?
That one can wait until later. It's more of a broader
Okay.
portion.
So, that was I think this is a good idea I'm going to show you. This is the more in depth. How did we do it? What do you need to think about? So we've done this piece of work and it requires a lot of thought because what we're doing is novel. So this was a talk given by my co-author where it's presenting this is again a body of work that we had to do. I think it's useful to go over in this context because you now have access to similar tools, so you're going to have to be addressing the same questions. Because the problem statement, as shown, is how do you integrate all these disparate data types when generally for part of the workflow to process a particular piece of technical data, a lot of complicated calculations and processing will be done to get to the point, for example, here, which I'm guessing might be ground penetrating radar data, but that is a sufficient data product at the end of the current processing for the work that's done, and you can present that. But when you have the ability to display information in a 3D world, how do you display this effectively? Does it even make sense even to put a virtual poster board up at a particular location and display that image as a bitmap image? Does that actually convey any useful information? So what we did was, because we knew we were going to build this 3D environment, is we sat down and we thought all the different techniques that we used during an on-site inspection, selected some of them for ones that we thought we might be able to display in a geospatial visual fashion, and then just think hard about how can we do it and also how should we do it. So that involved both thinking about the technique and the data products generated by the technique and what display types our 3D tool could actually display. Because there's no point coming up with an idea of, well, it'd be great if we could display it in this fashion if the tool you're using can't actually display your parameter in that way. So we did things like, for the seismic signals, obvious things were, where are the seismic stations located physically? But you're not interested so much in the seismic stations, you want to know where are the events that generate the seismic signals that the seismic stations record, which are then reconstructed from those signals. And you have the raw seismic trace data. So we set about thinking which of those parameters could map to a particular display type within the software. And we went through various ones, trying to think up best ways of doing it, and then starting to do exactly that. So I can skip over that one. Skip over that one. So yeah, so we picked 4 treaty relevant data types to display, which were 2D cross-sectional data, 3D volumetric data, what we called complex data, and survey data. And yes, as I've explained, we thought how easy would it be to get them to be visualized, and what value did we add by doing that. So here is an example. So processed imagery. Here are 2 snapshots of aerial imagery captured during an additional overflight. Each of those is a 40 megapixel image, but in isolation, only of limited use. What you really want to be able to do is see them in context and stitched together as a whole. So I processed the imagery and created both the orthophotograph and the high resolution terrain data that came as part of that processing, and which you've seen in the previous video. So now this horseshoe feature here, which was an engineered feature in the quarry as part of the inspection, is now contained somewhere within that box in this larger image, which we can see if we expand that image up. So this is useful because it now gives us high resolution imagery and terrain data, which can be used for a multitude of uses. But you need to collect a lot of images. Your overflights actually have to capture the images that you require. Depending on a number of factors, it can take a reasonable amount of time to convert all of your raw images to the mosaic to image. And of course, it requires specialist software to do it, unless you invest a lot of time yourself in generating a custom system. And unsurprisingly, it generates quite a lot of data. But the advantage is you can then do this once you've generated it, which you can imagine if you are a team leader who is trying to plan a field mission, having access to this sort of imagery whilst you're planning your field mission can be invaluable. Especially as I believe there was at least one case of a specification coming out, and this just compares it to the lower resolution satellite 30-meter resolution terrain data. Yes, at least one occasion where a seismic station was specified to be deployed in a particular location that was only about 20 meters from the road. Unfortunately, it wasn't clear on the topographic map that between the road and the location there was something like a 30-meter drop, which of course the inspection team didn't discover until they came out to the actual location, and then there had to be a discussion of, well, is it really critical that the station goes there, or can it go at a slightly different location that we can actually get to? So now this is looking at 2D cross-sectional data. So this is the ground resistivity data, and the advantage here is of doing this is you can see the data in context. So these were 2 orthogonal survey lines that can now be displayed in context where they were actually collected. And I was there when this data was first presented during the inspection, and it was presented in the classic way of coloured plots on a screen, and it took a while to notice that they were both, the horizontal scale was not uniform. So you can clearly see that one survey line is about twice the distance of the other, but of course when just shown on a plot it wasn't immediately clear that the scales, both the vertical and the horizontal scales, were different between the 2 plots. And in this case it's very easy around here, when you can look at it in free view, is there are signals indicating an anomaly that match between the 2 data sets, which also match with magnetometry data So from an inspection perspective, that's great. You've got two techniques using the same physics principles that say there's something there, and a second technique that uses independent physics principles also saying there's something there, which from an inspection team's perspective is really useful because it eliminates some of the questions or the responses that the inspected state party might come back with as to why you shouldn't worry about that, there's nothing there of interest. So this was an interesting one to think about. How on earth do you display seismic data? So again, we thought about what are the parameters that are useful. So the physical location of the stations, the magnitude of the events that are unfolded. We used the number of stations that were used to reconstruct an event as a proxy for confidence in the reconstruction, and the error ellipses that have been discussed in the North Korean work. And the advantage of thinking about this is you take a very complex data set and produce a very simple graphical form to represent the results from it. So we did this sort of thinking, well, the physical location of the station in 3 dimensions, well, can just be represented as a point in space. For the reconstructed events themselves, again, just a 3D, the epicenters can be represented as a point in 3-dimensional space. Magnitude has no geospatial meaning, but that can be useful because we can then just map that as the color to a color on the icon we use to indicate where the event is, and we can choose to represent our proxy of certainty or confidence in reconstruction by making that icon a multi-pointed star where the number of points equals the number of stations that were used in the reconstruction, and the error ellipse can simply be a semi-transparent shape. Semi-transparent so you know it's there, but you can also see if there's other data underneath it, which then hopefully means you can, as with this, display the data without cluttering your visual view of the rest of your area. So I'll not go through that. It's not that sort of presentation. So that's some of the how that was needed to produce the briefing videos that we saw earlier. If I find the original. There we go. So, final story. Is there a better way to share this experience? A bit like the on-site inspection, a big complicated thing has happened. We can produce reports, we can do PowerPoints, but is there a better way to let other people experience what happened so that they can be more informed, one, about what happened, but perhaps even the questions they then ask about the event that occurred, because there's nothing quite like being there to then understand when someone says we couldn't do this because of this seemingly trivial reason, and your obvious question is, well, why couldn't you do that? But if you're then in a room and you discover that there's a 100-ton piece of equipment that's been put into a corner, and you can see that, and then they say we couldn't check the serial numbers on the other side of the equipment because it was 100 kilograms and it was against a wall. Oh, right, okay, that is perfectly reasonable. There's nothing untoward about the reason you couldn't check those serial numbers. It was just a practicality that couldn't be avoided. So, again, to rest my voice a little bit, this is the letterpress verification simulation that occurred in the UK, RAF Honington. which was a quad exercise between the UK, the US, Norway and Sweden. One useful learning activity is it takes more than 30 seconds to get kitted up to go into a secure environment.
Okay.
Which is pretty good for realism in an exercise when you're actually doing the exercise where those things originally occurred. But there are limits to the simulation because that is obviously not how they were originally moved around the site. But it certainly added a level of realism, and also by playing it for real like this, going to an earlier point, none of the inspectors complained about how long it took for these activities to occur because they could see them. They could see that it really did take about 20 minutes for the container to be transported, unloaded, for the container to be opened and the bomb to be slid out. You know.
Is that a Sandia logo that's on?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was also an opportunity to test potential technologies that could be used for verification activities, because there's no reason to ask a lot of these questions of exactly how would you verify a treaty that was looking at the dismantlement of weapons from forward deployment to a verified dismantlement chain, because no one else has really had to do it. And so that was part of the activity, was learn by doing, and this is why it's not an exercise, because we're not you exercise a capability that you already have or you believe you've established. This was very much a simulation because it was literally trying things out to see what could work, and in a lot of the technologies, what even had the possibility of working. So these are, what you just saw was a COSIM, which is basically an electronic tag that allows you to, as you can see, seal the door, and it registers and records and can be read when, in a verifiable way, when it is opened and closed. And here's one of the things that's been done, is actually absence measurement. So in addition to, is that the item that is the treaty controlled item, you say there's nothing that's relevant to the treaty elsewhere on the site, well great, well we'll go and check that. And here was another thing. How do you move around a site? In this case, we had to walk, which meant by the time you factored in the process of getting onto the site, initial meetings to agree what the activities for the day were going to be, getting the teams to go out suited up, and for them to walk to the bunker that was sealed under the treaty to then open it in a verifiable way, that takes a lot of time. Which then means even if you have a fantastic technique that takes a mere 3 hours of measurement to record a fantastic verification parameter, it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to make use of that, simply because annoying human things like needing to eat and drink and go to the bathroom, and the time it physically takes to get into a location in a verified manner. So there's lots of learning points like this that seem trivial and sound trivial, when you explain it without being able to, to point at a video, or without somehow being able to let people experience the same things. And it's expensive to let people experience the same thing because, if nothing else, everyone had to fly to the UK for this activity.
Hello, my name is Dr. James Palmer and I work in arms control verification research. In this video I'm going to give a demonstration of our capability to use advanced 3D visualization. To do that, I will use those capabilities to create a briefing for the letterpress exercise. The letterpress was an international quad exercise between the UK, the USA, Norway and Sweden in 2017. The aim of the briefing will be to give you an understanding of the location, layout and some of the equipment used. A software package called GeoVisionary from a UK company called Vertalis was used to create this briefing. It allows us to create locations in 3 dimensions and interact with or view them in various ways, such as conventional computer displays, 3D displays, and immersive virtual reality systems. This will be a quicker method to convey that information than traditional briefing tools, such as slide presentations or written reports. Imagine the software provides me with an empty sandbox into which I can put different types of data. Importantly, this includes 3-dimensional data. The software displays information as a scene and allows us to interact with it by walking or flying around it. I will now build the scene for the letterpress briefing. Starting with the empty sandbox, I add a ground layer, in this case one for RAF Honington. This does not tell us much on its own, therefore I colour the ground according to its elevation to bring out the details of the landscape. It is more useful to add imagery on top of the ground, and I do that by first adding a map on top of the ground layer. This is an ordnance survey map for the airfield, and it is aligned to the ground and wrapped over the top of it. Other types of imagery are also useful, such as aerial photography of the ground. So I add some of that over the map imagery, and we can see what the airfield looks like from the air. So, now we have the basics of the topography and appearance of the location. I can add information about letterpress itself. I will use this aerial position as the starting point for the brief, and to introduce the exercise I will create a virtual poster board showing the letterpress logo on it. On the other side, I create another with a photograph from the exercise. As this is an interactive briefing tool, I create a custom control panel at the top of the view. This allows a user to explore the exercise as they wish. Clicking on a button will transport the user to the indicated location, after which they can freely explore that location. The panel also allows the user to turn certain features on or off to make it easier to understand what happened there during the exercise. That completes the starting point for the briefing. Other data types were also added to this scene. They included 3D models from computer-aided design and point cloud data from laser scanners. You will see examples of these during the briefing. There will be time after this video for you to use this briefing tool for yourselves. If it is available, then the virtual reality system will let you literally stand within one of the bunkers and explore it for yourselves. I will now begin the letterpress briefing. This briefing is an overview of the location and layout of the letterpress exercise and some of the activities that took place during it. We start at an aerial view of the exercise site with a map overlaid on the ground. This is the section of RAF Honington used for the exercise. Previously, it was the actual storage location for the UK's WE-177 nuclear weapon when it was in service. The main features are the double layer of fencing, the roads within the enclosure, and the rows of storage bunkers. We now change to aerial photography to gain an appreciation of the site from the air. Using the control panel, we fly down to the work area where 2 mobile accommodation units were used as offices, one for the hosts and one for the inspectors. One modified ISO container was the changing room for the inspectors, and one was a meeting room for host-inspector meetings. As we did not have 3D models for these structures, they have been represented as green rectangular solids. 2 virtual poster boards displaying photographs from the exercise have been placed in this area so you can see exactly what it looked like. The first shows the inside of the host's office, and the second shows the inspectors and hosts returning from a mission. We now use the map to follow in the footsteps of the inspectors to the bunkers. We are now moving much faster than even vehicles did during the exercise, so bear in mind that the inspector...
So I'm going to jump out of that purely because I think you'd be more interested to see the live demo of the same environment than the animation, but you get the idea that, and I hope it will be reinforced in the next 10 minutes or so, that having a 3D representation of where this simulation activity took place and being able to explore it both in the desktop and in virtual reality, you don't need to go to the location to answer many of the questions that you'll have about the activity, which will be useful for a number of factors, not least spreading understanding of exactly what happened, what the limitations were, and perhaps even planning for another activity in the same location. So, in summary, and to get on to the live demo, hopefully, well, we certainly have seen, and I hope you agree, that the 3 virtual worlds have been used to support non-proliferation work in different ways, and each was used to convey complex information by telling a story. So we had the DPRK test site, which was remote and inaccessible, the CTBTO integrated field exercise, which was a remote but accessible location, and finally the letterpress simulation, which was a local and accessible site. And because of the difference in those locations, it changed the sort of information that could be gathered about those locations and used in the 3D world. So finally, to reiterate, the tools and techniques used were not state-of-the-art but well established. This is what I would call the state of the possible. And importantly, you can use the same techniques to tell your own stories if these are the right tools for telling the stories you want to tell. So, are there any brief questions while I bring the live demo up?
Yes. Tons of questions. First of all, how long did it take you to produce this? So, for example, for the exercise in Jordan?
So, it's a slightly difficult question to answer in that this was the first time it was done, so we had to do a lot of the thinking. You know, how are we going to display this? How are we going to display that technique? So it was several months plus of effort to do all of that. But the software tool, as said, was you can consider it as a sandbox that you can put the data into. So I would expect that if it was decided that you would use such techniques as a matter of course, then the processing of particular data, you would add another processing step that would generate data products suitable for 3D visualization, which would then, in an automated fashion or semi-manual fashion, then be integrated within the 3D world. And in that case, if the data is all ready, then it takes relatively little time to load in data. So as Anne has seen with the work that we've done looking at loading data in, that, for example, once it's established, the IFE14 environment maybe takes a couple of minutes to load, as long as you have the data.
Once you decided on the type of data and you have the type of data available, then it's just the loading part that you map it to a particular.
Yeah. Yeah. You might have to reposition things manually or create special interfaces, but again, it can be, hopefully as you'll see now, from a user's perspective, pretty straightforward. So, hopefully this will work. So this is the environment that was created at Poynton. So one of the ways you navigate on the desktop is using one of these fancy space mice, which allows me to move around. And this is the custom interface, so clearly this is the user interface that you use to build, but because I produced this as a briefing tool, I've taken the time to create a custom interface. So I shall just click this one twice and then it slows down my flying speed. And here we can do things like toggle the map on and off. And here what I've actually done is made the map semi-transparent, so you can see both the features as they are indicated on the map and as they appear in reality, which can be very useful when you're trying to understand a new site. And we can click here, and now we fly down to where the offices were, and I've put in some photographs as virtual billboards to indicate, because I don't have realistic 3D models of the actual accommodation units, you can simply say that green polygon represents that greenish building, and this is what it actually looked like. And then that's all you need to say, because then people can fly back and look in and map within their own minds that that's what it looked like. And if we fly over here, this is now one of the bunkers, and the animation you saw showed the I'd commissioned our laser scanning team at AWE to go and laser scan the bunkers that we used as part of the exercise, so they could be put into an environment like this. And what you saw previously were the raw point cloud data that came out of the laser scanner. So you probably noticed that it appeared to be lots of points, and where there should be a solid wall, there was perhaps a shimmering effect as more points were loaded. I've subsequently found some software that allows me to generate a 3D mesh model directly from the point clouds, and that's what we see here instead. So this is, point clouds are a very large data format, so the point cloud for this was maybe 20 gigabytes, whereas the 3D model like this is maybe about 300 megabytes, including the texture. So if I fly over to it, you can see that it is solid, and because it's made up of several different laser scans, for some of this, between different scans, it might have picked up slightly different color for that particular surface, and that's why you end up with that striped effect, which if you were motivated to and it was worth your time and effort, you could pre-process the point clouds to eliminate that variability. But again, we have another photograph used as a virtual billboard, and there you can see the weapon casing and its storage. And the analogy of something being put up against the wall really did come from the exercise, because it could have been here, but well, actually, one advantage I can fly in and show you. So here we have the inside of the bunker with 2 CAD models of casings that were imported, which we can select and reposition if we like. So if you have all of the 3D models of the actual of the container, then you can literally rebuild the environment. But you can also see that this is not a huge room, and the casings take up a reasonable amount of that space, and you've seen how much bigger that the containers are for them. So you can, and as part of the simulation, we had put serial numbers on the front and the back hatch for the container and on the 2 sides. And of course, when you moved the weapon in its container over to a corner over here, there wasn't enough space to go around the back of the container. And because that wasn't thought about, and one of those things you were unlikely to think about it in advance, it was, well, what do we do now? Because the documentation the inspectors were following didn't account for it, and we didn't realise, the people writing the documentation, the work instructions, didn't realise that this ambiguity existed, because it said record the serial numbers of the container. And then it was like, well, we physically can't see the serial number. What do we do now? Is this a problem? Isn't it a problem? And that was the sort of thing, the learning points that were taken from the exercise, from the simulation, because it wasn't an exercise. So, any other questions?
For the Jordan exercise, were there any radionuclides included in it? And whether or not there had been, did you make any plans to overlay that data onto the virtual world?
Yes, we could. So, as part of the exercise itself, actual sources were buried within the quarry so that the diagnostics really would pick up a true signal. And we could have done, but it was just, we didn't have the time, and because it would have produced, having thought about it, it would produce a similar data set to the magnetometry data, the coloured snail trail. It wasn't necessary for us to repeat that, producing that sort of display for the radionuclide. But you've in a way answered your own question. Yes, you can do it. It's just a matter of thinking about it, working out how to process the data, and in some other discussions, you've got to sometimes think very, very deeply and address the subject matter experts as to how you can manipulate the data in order to display it, but not impact the scientific validity of the data. So in the case of the resistivity data, we had to remap the data and interpolate it, and I had to talk to the experts to find out, was remapping it and interpolating between the data points acceptable? Because there are two, either it was acceptable or the answer could have been no. It's a bit like drilling for a core. And imagine you're trying to find a large diamond and all you can do is drill for cores. If you drill here and the diamonds you're expecting is this big, and you drill here and don't see the diamond, I think we'd all agree that it would not be sensible to interpolate the absence of a diamond between this point and this point, because you might simply have missed the diamond. And if you were to interpolate, you would be making a scientifically incorrect assumption. Yes?
Hi. I teach a course called Nuclear 3D Verification in Virtual World.
Oh, fantastic.
Which is very much related to this. So it's much less sophisticated in some sense. So I think, are you going to be here tomorrow by chance?
No.
Oh,
right.
That's good. I have to go soon. So
I can connect you.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So it's based on the UK-Norway initiative exercise. I spent a week there and I got all their data and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So basically the way it works is it's just the students are divided, the class is divided into two groups. One group is inspecting party, the other one is the inspected party. And so we developed two worlds, two virtual worlds. One kind of nuclear facility with everything that's involved, the detectors that kind of work like detectors, nothing perfect. But so the students go through about one semester, pretty intense. First they learn a lot about verification. And then they actually develop the procedure together over something like 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets to be pretty intense with a lot of, so they only communicate through the virtual world, or at least I try to do that.
Okay.
It's pretty hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
And they communicate through letters, mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Like formal letters, kind of similar way to UK-Norway
Yep.
did it at the beginning, negotiations and all that stuff. And then finally, at the very last part, there's an actual verification exercise, which is really exciting because then the students really go head to head. It's worked out really well. I hope I can teach it again pretty soon. I'd love to learn for you some of the tricks.
Mm-hmm.
I have one important question. Back in 2013, I gave a presentation at the IEA suggesting to use virtual worlds, really avatar-based virtual worlds. So I'm not really talking about truly immersive stuff for training. And so for IFE 2014 is on the horizon. And the idea was that one of the concerns I had was about going into confined areas where there's safety are issues, the logistics of how you move stuff around, all that stuff you could use virtual reality training for. So I wonder what kind of progress they've made. I proposed it to Ron Gavish, who was the head of training at the time.
Okay, I wouldn't know. So my direct projects with the CTBTO ended a couple of years ago now.
Okay.
So I'm not in a position to know what they're currently doing in that area, but it would certainly be lots of interesting discussions, because even within the last 5 years, some of the things that you couldn't do then, I think you can do now, and well, as you've seen.
That's another thing, yeah. Things have moved so quickly.